There are secrets buried in legal documents that wait decades to surface, clauses written in moments of clarity and foresight that lie dormant until the precise circumstances trigger their relevance, transforming them from historical curiosities into instruments of revelation that reshape everything believed to be settled truth. Princess Diana's last will and testament had been examined countless times since her death in 1997, scrutinized by lawyers, executors, and family members who believed they understood every provision, every bequest, every intention she had documented in those final months of her life. But there existed within that document a conditional clause so carefully worded, so dependent on specific future circumstances that it had remained functionally invisible. For nearly 3 decades, waiting with the patience of prophecy for the exact moment when its conditions would be met, and its contents would explode into relevance with the force of a message from beyond the grave. What Diana had foreseen, what she had protected against with the terrible prescience of someone who understood exactly how institutions preserve themselves at the expense of individuals, was about to walk into the light and shatter the careful narratives that had been constructed around her memory, her intentions, and the forces that had destroyed her. The discovery of this clause, hidden in plain sight through the ingenious use of contingent language that only became operative under circumstances Diana had predicted with devastating accuracy, would force a reckoning that those in power had spent decades avoiding. She had known, even as she signed the document on June 1, 1993, that certain people would attempt to rewrite history, would work to diminish her influence over her sons' lives and values, would try to erase the protection she had tried to establish around them through her words and legal provisions. So she had crafted insurance, a time-delayed truth bomb that would activate only when the specific combination of factors she feared most actually materialized. And now, in February 2025, as institutional forces gathered to isolate William's children from the very sources of unconditional love Diana had fought to preserve, her words reached across the chasm of death to defend grandchildren she would never meet against threats. She had predicted with heartbreaking precision. The man who would discover this clause was not a family member but a legal scholar, researching royal wills for an academic project, someone with no agenda beyond historical accuracy and the intellectual curiosity to examine contingent provisions that most readers skipped over as irrelevant hypotheticals. What he found would shake the foundations of the current royal family's carefully maintained equilibrium, exposing decades of actions taken in direct violation of Diana's explicitly stated wishes and legal rights. And once Charles knows the truth, nothing will ever be the same. The March afternoon held that deceptive quality of early spring where sunlight suggests warmth that the air temperature refuses to deliver, and King Charles sat in his private study at Clarence House, attempting to focus on the routine correspondence that formed the administrative backbone of his daily existence. His hands, already less steady than they had been even a year ago, trembled noticeably as he broke the seal on the express envelope that had been hand-delivered from the office of Farrer & Co., the law firm that had served the royal family for generations and handled the most sensitive legal matters with discretion that bordered on absolute secrecy. The letter inside bore the signature of the firm's senior partner, a man Charles had known for 40 years and trusted implicitly, which made the contents all the more devastating because there could be no question of their accuracy or the motivations behind their revelation. The communication was brief but comprehensive, outlining the discovery of a conditional clause in Diana's will that had been legally binding since her death but operationally dormant until the specific triggering circumstances occurred. The partner explained that the clause had been brought to their attention by Professor Eleanor Hastings of Cambridge University, who had been conducting research into the legal structures of royal wills and had noticed language in Diana's testament that referenced future institutional actions affecting the welfare and family connections of my sons and their children. The professor, acting with the ethical obligations of someone who had stumbled upon potentially significant legal rights being violated, had contacted the firm to determine whether the clause remained valid and whether its conditions had been met. After careful review, the firm had concluded that the clause was indeed legally binding, that its triggering conditions had been satisfied by recent events within the royal family, and that Charles needed to be informed immediately of both the clause's existence and its implications. Charles's chest tightened as he read the attached excerpt from Diana's will, words she had written 32 years ago, but which read as though she had composed them yesterday. With full knowledge of current circumstances, the clause specified that if, at any point after both of her sons had married and produced children, institutional or family authority figures attempt to systematically separate my grandchildren from the maternal family connections that provide them unconditional love and stability, or to remove from their lives those individuals who protect them from institutional cruelty, then certain legal provisions would activate immediately. These provisions included the establishment of an independent trust, funded by assets Diana had separately secured, which would provide her grandchildren with financial independence from the institution and the legal right to maintain relationships with whomever they chose, regardless of institutional preferences. More devastating still, the clause required that her sons be provided with complete, unredacted documentation of all communications between Charles and Camilla during Diana's lifetime, materials that had been sealed under legal agreements, but which Diana had insisted must be disclosed if the specific circumstances she feared most actually materialized. The letter explained that the firm had already begun the process of establishing the trust as Diana's instructions required, that the relevant documents were being prepared for release to William and Harry, and that Charles was being informed as a courtesy before these actions became public through the necessary legal filings. The partner noted, with the careful neutrality of someone delivering information that would cause profound personal pain, that Diana had apparently anticipated this exact scenario, that institutional authorities would attempt to use their power to control her grandchildren's relationships and isolate them from sources of love that existed outside institutional control. She had, with remarkable foresight, created a legal mechanism that would activate in response to such attempts, providing her descendants with both resources and information that would allow them to make fully informed decisions about their relationship with the institution and the people who led it. The terrible cleverness of it was that Diana had not relied on trust or hope that future generations would respect her wishes. She had created legally binding obligations that would execute automatically when her worst fears proved justified. Charles sat in the gathering darkness of late afternoon, his hands shaking so badly that the papers rustled audibly in the silence, holding evidence that would tear the family apart. The documents Diana had arranged to be disclosed were not comprehensive records of every interaction between Charles and Camilla during their affair, but rather a carefully curated selection of communications that Diana's solicitors had obtained through various legal means during the divorce proceedings, and that Diana had specifically chosen for their revelatory value. The earliest dated to March 14, 1989, a letter from Camilla to Charles discussing Diana with a casual cruelty that suggested such conversations were routine between them. Camilla had written, with a tone of amused contempt, about Diana's struggles with postnatal depression following Harry's birth, referring to her as your neurotic princess who manufactures drama to maintain your attention. She had suggested that Charles needed to stop indulging her constant need for emotional reassurance and recommended that he allow her to understand that royal wives are meant to produce heirs and manage appearances, not expect their husbands to function as therapists for their various psychological inadequacies. The letter made clear that Camilla viewed Diana not as a human being suffering genuine mental health challenges, but as an inconvenient obstacle whose pain deserved mockery rather than compassion. A second document, dated August 7, 1991, revealed Camilla's response to learning that Diana had begun working with eating disorder specialists to address her bulimia. The letter to Charles expressed disbelief that he was allowing her to air the family's private difficulties to strangers under the guise of treatment, and suggested that Diana's illness was obviously a manipulative performance designed to generate sympathy and cast you as the villain in a marriage where she has consistently failed to meet even basic requirements of discretion and dignity. Camilla had written, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, evident even through the written word, that some women simply lack the constitution for royal life and spend their entire existence making everyone around them suffer for their inadequacy. The dismissal of Diana's genuine medical condition as performance and man-up. Devastating to imagine scenarios where she was gone and her boys needed her voice, her protection, her explicit documentation of what she had experienced, and what she feared would be visited upon them or their children. There had been one afternoon in her solicitor's office, May 28, 1993, when the full weight of what she was doing had overwhelmed her carefully maintained composure. She had been reviewing the specific language about institutional attempts to separate her grandchildren from maternal family connections, and something inside her cracked as she realized she was literally writing instructions for people who did not yet exist, for children her sons had not yet conceived, for battles that might be fought decades after her death. She had broken down completely, weeping with the desperate grief of someone who understood that her love might not be enough to shield those she cherished most from the machinery designed to grind individuals into institutional compliance. But after 15 minutes of uncontrolled crying, she had composed herself with the fierce determination that characterized her final years. She had returned to the work of perfecting the language, of ensuring that no loopholes existed through which institutional lawyers might invalidate her provisions, of creating something that would stand as permanent testimony to what she had endured, and permanent protection for those who might face similar threats in a future she would not live to see. Her motivation was crystalline in its purity. If she could not be there physically to stand between her descendants and institutional cruelty, she would create legal instruments that would execute that protection automatically, that would provide resources and truth that would allow them to make informed decisions about whether the institution deserved their service and loyalty. She endured it all with grace, never letting anyone see the wounds beneath, never revealing to William and Harry that their mother was constructing elaborate defenses against threats she prayed would never materialize but feared with every fiber of her being eventually would. The evening of March 15, 2025, brought together the principal figures in this decades-long drama for a dinner that Charles had requested, ostensibly to discuss the recent tensions around the children's schedules and care arrangements. William and Catherine had arrived at Clarence's house with the wary exhaustion of people who had been fighting institutional battles for weeks and who no longer trusted that any gathering called in the name of reconciliation was not actually another ambush disguised with diplomatic language. Charles had seemed unusually subdued when he greeted them, his face reflecting a sleeplessness and distress that suggested he was wrestling with something more profound than the administrative disputes about grandchildren's visitation that had dominated recent family conversations. Camilla had been gracious in her welcome, playing the role of concerned family elder with the practiced ease of someone who had spent decades perfecting public performance. But there was something brittle in her composure that suggested she sensed vulnerability in the air and was already preparing defensive positions. The meal proceeded with excruciating formality through the first courses, conversation limited to the most superficial pleasantries and observations about neutral topics that allowed everyone to avoid the tensions crackling beneath the surface. William found himself studying his father, recognizing in Charles's distraction and evident distress something more than the usual discomfort that characterized their recent interactions. It was not until the staff had withdrawn after the main course, leaving the family alone in the private dining room, that Charles finally revealed what had prompted this gathering. "I have received information," he began, his voice carrying the weight of someone forcing himself through a conversation he desperately wished to avoid, regarding your mother's will. There was a clause I was not previously aware of, conditional provisions that have apparently now been triggered. The room went absolutely silent as Charles explained, with visible difficulty, what the lawyers had discovered and what Diana's will now required. He described the trust being established for William's children, the financial independence it would provide them from institutional control, and then, with hands that shook visibly, He revealed the other provision, the release of documentation regarding his relationship with Camilla. During Diana's lifetime, William felt the world tilt as his father admitted that Diana had secured evidence of communications between Charles and Camilla, evidence that Diana's solicitors had determined should be disclosed to her sons if specific circumstances occurred, circumstances that had now been satisfied by recent institutional attempts to control his children's family relationships. Charles concluded by saying, with evident devastation, that he had reviewed the documents and that they contained materials he had hoped his sons would never see, conversations that revealed aspects of the situation during Diana's life that contradicted narratives that had been carefully maintained for decades. Before William could formulate a response, Camilla's composure shattered with startling completeness. "This is absolutely unconscionable," she said, her voice sharp with a rage that overwhelmed her usual careful control. "That woman has been dead for nearly 30 years, and she's still trying to destroy our family from beyond the grave. These documents are being taken completely out of context. Private communications that were never meant for outside eyes, being weaponized by solicitors looking to create drama, and by Diana's desperate attempt to remain relevant forever." She turned to Charles with fury that barely acknowledged William and Catherine's presence. "You cannot allow this to proceed. You are the king. You have authority to block the release of these materials, to challenge the validity of these absurd provisions that Diana created specifically to cause maximum damage to our relationship with William and his children. This is her final revenge, and you are simply going to let it happen?" The weight of betrayal filled the air, so thick it was nearly visible. William felt something fundamental shift inside him, a tectonic movement of understanding and fury that had been building for months, but now found perfect focus. Before he could speak, a voice interrupted from the doorway. James Harding, the children's head protection officer who had been temporarily suspended, but who had apparently been invited by someone who believed he needed to be present for this conversation. "Forgive me," he said, addressing the room but looking directly at Charles, "but I cannot remain silent while history is rewritten before my eyes. I have served this family long enough to know the truth of Diana's fears, because I have watched them come to pass. Every concern she documented in those legal provisions has proven accurate. Her grandchildren are being systematically isolated from sources of unconditional love. Institutional authority is being used to punish parents who resist cruelty, and the same woman who tormented Diana is now tormenting Diana's grandchildren while demanding that everyone pretend it's about institutional necessity rather than personal vendetta." Other witnesses had apparently been assembled for this moment. William's private secretary, who had reviewed the legal documentation, Catherine's former protection officer who had observed family dynamics over years, even one of Diana's former staff members who had been present during some of the conversations Diana had with her solicitors about the will provisions. Each offered testimony not about abstract legal interpretations, but about witnessed patterns, observed behaviors, and the undeniable reality that Diana's worst fears about how the institution and Camilla would treat her descendants had proven horrifyingly prescient. They spoke of Camilla's treatment of Charlotte specifically, of the recent attempts to separate all 3 children from the Middleton family, of the systematic efforts to remove every person who might protect the children or tell them truth that contradicted official narratives. Catherine finally spoke, her voice carrying the quiet devastation of someone whose last illusions had been incinerated. "Diana knew," she said, looking at Charles with something close to pity. "She knew exactly what would happen because she had lived it. She knew that institutional power would be used to crush individual happiness, that cruelty would be disguised as duty, that her sons and their children would face the same campaigns of isolation and control that destroyed her, and she created protections because she understood that love alone would not be enough against people willing to use unlimited authority to achieve their objectives. She was trying to save us from across death itself, and the fact that her provisions have now been triggered proves she was absolutely right to create them." William stood, the documents his father had provided still clutched in hands that had gone numb from gripping them too tightly. "I want every document Diana arranged to be disclosed. I want to read every communication, understand the full scope of what she endured and what she predicted would be visited upon my family, and then I will make decisions about my children's relationship with this institution and the people who lead it based on complete information rather than the carefully curated version of history I have been fed my entire life. He looked directly at Camilla, no longer bothering with the deference protocol demanded. My mother saw you clearly, and she documented what she saw so that her grandchildren would be protected from you. The fact that you are